Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call to order our October 4th Growth Management Policy Board meeting to order. Great to see everybody. Let's start with a round of introductions. My name is Ryan Mello. I serve as the chair here at the Growth Management Policy Board. We'll go to my right.
Good morning. Hank Margerson, serve as your vice chair, representing Sound Cities and City of Redmond.
Larry Gossett, King County Council.
Jay Arnold, Deputy Mayor in Kirkland, representing Sound Cities.
Nancy Tost, Council Member, City of Burien, representing Sound Cities Association.
There we go. Peter Steinbrook, representing Northwest Seaports.
Jan Schweddy, Arlington City Council, representing Snohomish County.
John McClellan, representing Alderwood Water and Wastewater District.
Terry Ryan, representing Snohomish County.
Patricia Akiyama, representing Master Builders Association and Business and Labor.
Chris Rizbicki, FutureWise.
Ron Peltier, Bainbridge Island City Council, representing towns and cities in Kitsap County.
Rob Putantu, Port Orchard Mayor.
Good morning, Greg Wheeler, Mayor, City of Bremerton.
Thank you, everyone. We have a little switcheroo of the SCA caucus and the Kitsap caucus here. You guys are keeping us on our toes this morning. We have a number of members, I believe, we're expecting on the phone. If you can indicate your presence, that would be great. Commissioner Ed Wolf from Kitsap County.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor John Shelmanak from Bellevue.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor. Councilmember Scott Bader, Everett.
Good morning.
Thank you. Mark McCaskill, Department of Commerce. Mark, are you there? Dr. Susan Turner from the Kitsap Public Health Department. Peter Mayer, Metro Parks Tacoma.
Present, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I don't think there's anybody else, but we're joined by Councilmember Johnson. Good morning, Councilmember. Item number 3 is communications. There's no formal communications, but we do have 2 members of the public signed up for public comment, 3 members. So each member of the public wishing to give comment has 2 minutes to speak. We have an on-screen timer so that speakers can keep focused and on track, and we ask that you be respectful, and I'll use my discretion if I don't think you're respectful. We will close your time and move on to the next speaker. So I have Mr. Alex Zimmerman up first. Mr. Zimmerman.
Sie Heil, the best people friend. A little bit Nazi, a little bit communist, and a little bit cretina. My name Alex Zimmerman. Guys, the situation what is we have right now, with election what is we have this year, show fascism in Seattle, Puget Sound region in state Washington go deeper and deeper and deeper. I try find reason why this happened. When I come something to conclusion what is very typical Democrat, you know what is mean in agenda, race and social justice. So I find this, it's nice, and I like this. 4 brown consul in Seattle who represent 7%.
Mr. Zimmerman?
That's unacceptable. Yeah.
You're approaching the line very quickly. Ask you to keep your remarks respectful and hopefully on topic to the germane business of this entity.
Exactly. I spoke about you because you're management. You're supposed to be doing a good job, what you don't doing. So I try find, understand, like professional business consultant, where is point of this? It's my opinion. It's exactly about America. I'm totally confused. I am in America right now, or this Nazi or Soviet Union. It's exactly what is I have. I have my opinion, professional opinion, where is problem come from. Is this exactly what is I want delivery to you? So please give me another 30 seconds so I can deliver this.
No, please proceed.
How you can deliver a business opinion ever for 2 minutes? Sometimes you need a couple year for delivery one small business opinion. And you always cut me over for 2 minutes. Guys, you sorry, but you are looking like a real Nazi social democrat.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. The next person we have signed up is Dan Cardwell from Pierce County. Mr. Cardwell?
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Mello, members of the board. My name is Dan Cardwell, and I'm providing comments this morning on behalf of Pierce County Council Member Derek Young, as he is attending a council budget meeting this morning. The comments focus on the board's discussion on the potential alternatives for Vision 2050's draft supplemental environmental impact statement, also known as a DSEIS. Since PSRC staff first presented preliminary information to you on the alternatives, they have received feedback from different staff groups on the technical aspects and assumptions. It is my understanding that staff will be presenting updated information to you today, and we ask that members of the GMPB take the updated information into consideration as it discusses and ultimately decides the range of alternatives for the DSEIS. While some members of this board have stated at previous meetings that the dispersed urban growth alternative isn't consistent with Vision 2040, particularly the regional growth strategy, it should be recognized that the objective of Vision 2040 is to achieve a sustainable environment, and the regional growth strategy is just one component to achieve this objective. Vision 2040 is comprised of 4 parts: a sustainable environment framework, the regional growth strategy, multi-county planning policies, and implementation strategies. There's an opportunity to dial the knob back on one component of this and then forward on another to balance the differences and achieve a sustainable environment. In selecting the range of alternatives, this board should consider the people that already live here, 2/3 of the projected population, and the growth patterns that have already occurred. Vision isn't just about the growth of roughly 1.2 million people. It is also about the quality of life who have already live and work here in our region. So
Mr. Cardwell, sorry, just out of fairness, if you could summarize the comments.
So with these points in mind, we ask that this board doesn't just write off the dispersed urban growth alternative and that there are benefits for having it as part of the EIS alternative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sarabrin from Transportation Choices Coalition, you're the last person we have signed up this morning. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the GMPB. My name is Hester Sarabrin, and I'm the Policy Director at Transportation Choices Coalition. We've submitted a letter today for your consideration as you move forward towards selection of the RGS alternatives to be studied in the EIS. The RGS is the backbone of Vision. It shapes our density, our access to jobs and housing and mobility. It determines whether and how much we develop on resource lands. At the outset of Vision, the board identified affordable housing, social equity, and climate change as key priorities. It's therefore critical that the RGS sets us up to grow in a way that reduces GHG emissions, promotes affordable housing stock, and provides access to that housing, jobs, and services through healthy, sustainable, and affordable transportation. I urge you to advance only scenarios that move us toward our goals. That may include new hybrid scenarios that are tweaked to maximize performance across the screening measures. Our current measures elucidate how the scenarios perform in terms of VMT reduction and a rough proxy for housing type. However, as we state in our letter, the measure for social equity is not able to indicate whether or not we are improving outcomes for low-income people and people of color through these scenarios. Whether adding more growth in high-opportunity areas is a positive or negative thing is unclear, and without a deep board discussion of the different ways this could play out, we believe the board does not have sufficient information to make a decision. Therefore, I urge you to set aside time today to discuss the nuances of this measure or ask for a proxy for access to opportunity that has a clear desired direction with data we know to be available, such as access to jobs by transit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the letter that we received today. Summarizing your comments. Is there anyone else wishing to provide comment to this policy board? Anyone else wishing to provide comment? Seeing none, we'll move on to item number 4, the director's report. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning. And let me just click on this slide here. The first thing I wanted to mention to you all was that we received a letter from Transportation Choices and others. Hester just kind of took care of that announcement. That's available on the side counter, and if anybody needs it, let me know. Some good information to consider as we have the discussion about the regional growth strategy, some of the discussion there about social equity issues. We can look and talk about that a little bit as we talk about developing these alternatives. They'll be also examined more during the SEPA process, and we will have an environmental justice portion of the SEPA analysis as we go through and look at the different alternatives. So that's just a quick response. I also wanted to note that I took time and had a meeting with Jeff Clark at the Alderwood Water and Wastewater District this last month, had a great discussion about how we're forming these alternatives and how to recognize within that environmental analysis the differences of if we don't grow as much as we currently estimate and how we can capture that through the environmental review process. Also, I had the pleasure of meeting with Councilmember Peltier a couple weeks ago. We had a great discussion. He has some ideas about how to, I think, inform and improve any of the alternatives that we come up with. I think he's going to hold those off maybe until we get to some future meetings. We talk about some of the different environmental and other aspects of the alternatives, but I'll let him to speak to those as he thinks the time is right. But had a great conversation, really enjoyed having that meeting. Also wanted to let you know that in addition to the two items that are on your agenda today, Kelly McGurty on our staff had a discussion with the Regional Staff Committee about climate change and how we're looking at that. The Puget Sound Clean Air Agency has released an updated inventory for the region of greenhouse gas emissions. That's very useful. It's worth taking a look at. So we're having that discussion at the staff level, and at one of your upcoming meetings, we'll have a more in-depth briefing for you about climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and how that plays into the development of these alternatives and the update to vision. One last little fun thing that I wanted to mention is that we had an Economic Development District Board meeting yesterday, and one of the things that they announced was that we've released an updated economy or econometric report about the space industry. There's a little one-page or two-page flyer that we've also developed about the benefit of the space industry in our region. It's kind of fun. If you're interested in the space industry or some of the economic aspects, you may want to take a look at the report.
Thank you, Paul. I won't comment on who I want to send to space these days. For the record, welcome Dr. Chan and Councilmember O'Brien. Thank you for being with us this morning. We're going to move on to item number 5, the consent agenda. Vice Chair Margison.
Move the consent agenda.
It's been properly moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion's adopted. Our first discussion item this morning, we'll get right into Vision 2050 and our continued focus on housing and work staff has done on our behalf based on our conversations about housing. And so, Paul, I'm going to ask you to start us off again, please.
Right. I just wanted to take a real quick introduction of Vision 2050 overall. I think everybody here around the table is kind of familiar with where we're at. Going through scoping, talking about the update, spending a lot of time recently on the regional growth strategy, and that's important for our process path of defining those alternatives so we can do the environmental analysis as far as distribution patterns. But we recognize that there are a lot of other policy issues within Vision about how do we grow, how do our communities work and coordinate with each other at a regional scale. Housing's been one issue that we've had some discussion with you when you had a detailed meeting back in June on. We are queuing up some of the other topics so that as we define the alternatives and send them off to our SEPA consultant for some of the detailed work during the winter, that we'll have engagements starting really with the next meeting and then going into December and January and February talking about some of those other policy areas. So we want to let you know, one, that we haven't forgotten about those other important issue areas. We'll be spending some time over the next several months talking about them and working towards then kind of bringing these back together of talking about both growth patterns and the scenarios, how those form into alternatives, and trying to define a preferred pattern of growth, but also these policy areas of how we grow and how we coordinate at a regional scale. So just wanted to kind of have that broad introduction about where we're at in the process. Again, trying to get towards having a draft of the overall plan by next June, so that we can have a recommendation on the plan by the end of next year. So things are going to move quickly month by month, but we have a lot of different work and a lot of things set up for you over the next several months. So with that, I'm just going to turn it directly over to Laura to jump into the housing discussion.
Great, thank you. Good morning. I'm here to touch base on housing. We last spoke to you at your July meeting when we had the extended meeting and small group discussions. Since then, staff's looked at the Vision housing chapter, spoken to some other stakeholders, and wanted to share some potential changes that we've been brainstorming on and get your direction. And we are on page 6 of the packet for folks who are following along in that way. So quickly, we'll do a quick overview of what's currently in the housing chapter in Vision 2040, a summary of the feedback we've received to date. Then we'll do an overview of potential updates to the housing chapter based on what we see that's currently in Vision and the feedback we received, and kind of how we can fill those gaps and strengthen some things, and then discuss next steps. So the housing chapter in Vision 2040 includes a lot of great, strong policies about housing production, the location of housing. When it talks about affordability, it discusses both components, both preserving existing affordability and developing new affordable units, and also talks about environmentally friendly and safe homes. There are 2 actions in the housing chapter. Both are pretty robust. The first is to develop a regional housing strategy, which includes a regional needs assessment, so that would be a pretty big data lift, as well as establishing a regional housing program, which includes various components, including technical assistance, guidance through comprehensive plan updates, and ongoing monitoring. And we have been doing some of that work since 2008. So a few things to keep in mind since Vision was adopted in spring of 2008. Quite a bit has changed in the housing arena. So we've gone through the Great Recession, and while we've come out of it for the most part, we see changes in labor markets, construction markets, financial markets, just kind of that landscape has changed a bit. We've seen historic population and job growth, and kind of the strain and demand that's put on the housing market. We've also seen historic transit investments from ST2 and ST3 to fast ferries and the expansion of bus rapid transit in all 4 counties. And then we've also seen a lot of great work being done at various levels. At the regional level, we've done growing transit communities, looking at housing and growth in transit communities, as well as the Housing Innovations Program. And that work, and also some guidance on local comprehensive plans, has really helped to create kind of a regional forum around housing and have PSRC act as an information clearinghouse. We've also seen sub-regional efforts such as ARCH and AHA up in Snohomish County, and then local work through comprehensive plans and housing strategies. So we've had quite a few housing discussions to date. We got many housing comments during the scoping comment period. We had a 3-hour work session in May on housing, got a lot of great feedback. Been to the regional staff committee several times since then, and then last spoke to you at the July meeting where we had the extended meeting with the small group discussions. And from all of these discussions, we've had 3 key themes that have kind of risen to the top. The first is to address long-term housing supply. So this is really looking at market rate housing, saying how can we get the number of units and a diversity of the types of units to meet need now and in the future, to promote affordable housing in all development. So this is looking at folks who, based on need, based on income, probably aren't going to be working within that private market rate housing. So saying, what can we do to make sure that there is long-term affordable housing for folks? And then third, to invest in communities to maintain affordability. So we see that with growth and investment in the community, that communities that used to be affordable no longer are. We see communities changing. So looking at how can we prepare to and respond to these changes so that people who live in a community now can continue to do so. And when we last spoke to you about housing in July, we kind of threw up a couple very high-level changes that we were proposing. to update the narrative in housing data. Right now, a lot of the housing data is from the 2000 census, so it's pretty dated. So just making sure that we update that and kind of capture current conditions. To include data on housing need at all income levels. So really trying to better understand, state who are we talking about? Who are these people? What kind of income levels are they making? What percentage of the population are they? So really trying to set that foundation before we dive into the policy work in the chapter. Generally to retain policies with direction from the board, and then to explore new housing actions. And since we spoke to you in July, since we've done some internal reviews, talk to stakeholders as well, this generally still seems like the direction that we'd recommend heading in. So we'll dive into a little bit more detail into some of those changes, and just kind of tee things up as we're going through this. Really the question we're asking for the board are these potential changes headed in the right direction? Do these changes respond to the feedback we've heard? Do we feel like they have the potential to strengthen the chapter and kind of move us in the direction that we'd like to be headed in?
Commissioner Steinbrook?
Thank you. Just a quick question, Laura. Thanks very much for the update and refresher on where we've been. I wanted to ask if the data collection also an update would attempt to pair demographic data with regard to incomes and household sizes with supply data. In other words,
yes,
where the mismatches are in terms of at different levels, 30, 60, 80, median, et cetera. What's out there, where the gaps are.
We currently have that in the housing background paper that was released this past summer, and we can definitely make sure to include some of that in the chapter.
And does it also include household types or sizes?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Alrighty, so as we walk through some of these potential changes, we're kind of using the buckets of these three key themes. So the first for address long-term housing supply. What we heard, kind of summarizing that the region needs to plan for housing in the short and the long term, really that we're all players in the housing game. We all need to plan and be looking forward. And also that the region needs to take advantage of housing opportunities around transit investments, that really, this is an opportunity now. We don't invest in transit and in our transportation systems like this on a regular basis. So really, how can we leverage those opportunities? And it's been great to see that many of the transit agencies around the region are getting more involved in TOD and seeing themselves as players in that. So based on that, staff recommend two potential changes. The first is to have a new policy that emphasizes housing as a regional issue with a focus on housing near transit and centers. Right now, Vision has some really general language on the need to increase housing production and have housing throughout the region, but we feel like something that's a little bit more directive and more specific on housing near services, near transportation could be beneficial. As well as taking another look at the first housing action, which looks at the regional housing strategy and making sure that it's written in such a way that acknowledges, the time, the staffing, the ongoing work that's going to be needed to make that a reality. So we can pause here and just any thoughts on, are these potential updates headed in the right direction?
Mayor Patanzu.
Button here. So what are the teeth to that? I mean, is it a local control? We're going to identify things in our counties and our communities to implement this, or is it something that PSRC is going to drive?
Are you referring to the new policy or to
these policies, yeah, and the potential actions?
So I think the general understanding is that with most MPPs, a big part of it is that it's then reflected in consistency with the countywide planning policies and with the local comprehensive plans, so that we kind of have the policies step through in that way, and that also that these actions where at the regional level we can provide more guidance, more data, and things like that, that can be a support. We'll also get to it a little bit later in the presentation that we have heard questions and wanting to discuss more about accountability. And that's something we would like to bring back to the board at a future meeting.
Councilmember Schwede?
If I could just make a suggestion. We're talking about affordable housing at all levels. Everyone is. And what it means now and what it meant 4 and 5 years ago is completely different. Is it possible for us to come up with a term for the AMI housing, like income restricted, as opposed to calling it affordable when we're calling affordable for all income levels? Because it gets confusing along the line. So affordable for any of us might not be affordable for AMI. And so is there a way we could clarify that so that we know exactly what we're talking about?
We can look into that and see what peer regions and other groups have done to try and kind of make it more clear who you're talking about and what type of housing you're talking about.
Councilmember Ryan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yes, I think we're on the right track here. And earlier we talked about transit-oriented development. I mean, that makes transit-oriented development makes a lot of sense, especially with all the investments that we've put into community transit as well as sound transit up into the county. It makes sense to put the growth around that primarily. So I want to commend you and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Arnold?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we're on the right track, but I would like to see if we could explore ways to be more aggressive. A lot of the language in the current 2040 talks about encouraging different income levels and talks about giving priority to funding around transportation facilities, around regional growth centers. And I don't see from what you're suggesting here anything that reflects the greater emphasis on transit-oriented development and transit-focused growth. And while you talked about multi-county planning policies not being as directive, I do think we can set some standards here. We're going to be asking counties and cities, we're going to be certifying plans as being consistent with counties and cities. And if we don't have more transit-focused growth, we're going to see more of what we see today, whereas the market pushes growth to the outskirts of the region, which stresses our regional transportation system. So I would encourage us to look for ways to be more aggressive in setting standards in the policies, being more directive around the transit-focused growth.
Thank you. Commissioner Steinbrook?
I'm interested in probing further the question of can these strategies be implemented if we have a set of strategies we agree to within the regional growth strategy for housing. The question of how do they get implemented and by whom? And I'm thinking that PSRC has very limited tools for implementation. We have funding, we have a regional plan, and we have a regional forum, which is a powerful thing in itself, such as this, but we don't have any direct, PSRC doesn't have real direct implementation powers that would represent a toolbox. So I think that needs more fleshing out as to what is in the toolbox, what is up to local jurisdictions, what's interjurisdictional, and how can PSRC be a force for positive change in terms of future actions.
Thank you. Councilmember Pelletier?
Yeah, I'd like to second that. I think we need more tools in our toolbox. We've been discussing housing on Bainbridge Island for, seems like ever since we incorporated as a city. And it's constantly apparent that we don't have enough tools to really promote specifically affordable housing. You can always have more housing by just increasing density. But I would like to see PSRC work with the state. I noticed this section here on outreach and state coordination. I'm particularly interested in community land trusts, how we can promote those, perhaps get funding. We've been discussing inclusionary zoning. There seems to be some limits on how much we can require developers to build in the way of affordable housing when they do new development. So I would like to see us talk about more tools, and I don't think the state, for the mandate it's given local jurisdictions, has given us the tools we need.
Thank you, Councilmember O'Brien.
I'll just reiterate some of the comments I've heard. Deputy Mayor Arnold, I think a lot of what you said I support. I think to the question, are we heading in the right direction? Yes, definitely. I would like to see some more specificity around what, where we want to locate the housing, what levels of affordability. As an example, I think historically we've focused a lot of our subsidy dollars on the lowest income communities, but what we've seen with our economic realities today is that we're needing to subsidize people at higher and higher income levels, whereas the free market used to provide kind of the middle income housing. That's not happening anymore, so maybe specific strategies around that missing middle. And I also think we should talk specifically about the different tools that we need, whether it's incentive zoning or inclusionary housing. But I think the direction's good, and I just think it would be good to make the policy a little more robust as we move to the next phase.
Thank you, Dr. Chin.
I think what all the comments reflect are that we kind of know what we need to do, but it's not happening. And I think while these are the appropriate steps for staff to look at, there's a big thing I think that's missing, and it's really a decision for this board as a whole to look at, which is the system that we have now, right there, it's supposed to be market-driven, but it's kind of weird. It's not really driven by what the needs are, right? So, for example, there's an article, I think this past week, talking about how builders are flipping from apartments to condos. And that doesn't really reflect what people want. It reflects what the profit is and the issues around the liability of condos, right? So when you look at homes that people buy now, they really don't have a choice, right? If you want to buy a single-family home, you're going to buy a home that's going to have a dining room that you usually don't use except when visitors are there. You get a living room that, no one sits in except for the nice furniture, And these are things which, from a policy standpoint, are dysfunctional, right? So did you go with the Tacoma delegation to Denmark, right? I mean, I know from Tacoma and Pierce County, they went to Denmark. I know a lot of people have been going to Europe. Their living choices are different. The culture there is you don't have all this wasted space. And it's fine for people to live in row houses and townhouses. But people here don't have that same choice. It's the builders and what they claim to be the market is not necessarily what people really want or need. So I think at some point, the conversation needs to shift to what is the high-level policy that the people around this table want, and how are you going to get there, and then adopt tools that this body traditionally has not talked about: collective impact, social marketing, other things that are going to really get to the issues around how do we really make this happen? How much power do you have? As long as we have a free market economy, you really don't have any power. But if you adopt these other strategies of moving towards true, getting the community to really envision what they need at different life stages, for their families and so on, and then really move towards demanding that, or I shouldn't say demand, but working with the people who build the homes and do the developments to really try to address those needs rather than them creating what they think people want and makes the most money. So, and that's a really very cosmic statement, right? But I think that if you just keep going the way you are, we know what the results are. I mean, even inclusionary housing, my understanding is it works for a short period of time, but over time, as those units get resold and whatever, it loses that benefit, right? So we're not going to be able to accomplish this big change we need to do unless we really think about other strategies that we can work on for implementation of them.
Thank you, Dr. Chin. Mayor Wheeler.
Thank you, Chair Mello. So I'm glad that we are focusing. The direction is a good direction. And hopefully no doors will be shut. We do need to have the conversation, as Dr. Chen has said, and it'll have to be a different one than we've had before, dealing with just a market, market-driven housing policies. Let's face it, if we do have our transit-oriented development and the market drives all workforce our workforce out of the cities, then we are just exacerbating the problem and creating more congestion on our freeways and creating a housing, imbalance. And so we have to look at that. We've always, and the city of Bremerton is the same as I think a lot of other jurisdictions. We've always tried to play by the rules of, with managing our growth, because we know we get infrastructure dollars, and we believe in the mandates of protecting our environment, our open spaces, and consolidating growth. But if the effect on that is forcing people out of the center and jamming up our highways, then we aren't meeting the mark here. We're actually creating a negative impact on our environment and on people. I don't know how we're going to do this, but I believe the scoring criteria for projects when we go to look at our jurisdictions is going to have to change. We're going to have to take into account these type of impacts, and we may even have to, and not that we should, I want to solve problems right today, but I foresee us needing to look at jurisdictions and what are they doing locally. It is in jurisdictions' control on how they manage this. It's not all market. There's other things you can do to develop housing, and I think that's going to be part of the grading strategy and the criteria in the future. I appreciate the path we're on, though, as an organization.
Thank you. Councilmember Gossett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have the opportunity to be on a King County-based Affordable Housing Task Force, and that's 15 elected officials from around the county trying to figure out what we could recommend to our colleagues across the county, in suburban cities, the city of Seattle, and King County government. First of all, like most people have said, we agree with the promotion of more affordable housing as a policy and as a strategy moving toward 2040. But in King County, we have identified that we need 244,000 units of housing by 2040, 22 years. And it's going to be extremely difficult to get there because we've identified that 133,000 of that has to be affordable to people who make 50% or less of the average income in King County, which now is $82,000 per household. For African Americans, the average household income in Seattle is $37,000. Hence, when we look at the central area where a lot of African Americans used to live, we've only had recently one big project that's about to open that's affordable. It's 120 units on Union and 23rd, and it's for people making, the rents will be $400 to $1,100. It's very low, but it's not nearly enough. If you look at the majority of housing developed in the central area over the last 20 years, it's been affordable only to people that make moderate and market rate salaries, 73 to 78,000, and not to the historically poor or the working poor families that had traditionally lived there. So they've been pushed out. So we can't just have development of housing that's focused on inside the cities if we don't address the problem of affordability. Seattle Housing Authority, if they hadn't developed their Hope 6 emphasis where they build moderate market and low-income housing in their historic neighborhoods of Holly Park and Rainier Vista and High Point and New Holly, then it probably wouldn't exist, because the leadership of that organization has pointed out that the federal commitment to providing housing, to build or maintain housing affordable to people that make 25% or less, like the housing projects used to, has dwindled to 10, 15% of what it was in 1970, 1980, so they can't rely on federal subsidization to maintain even the housing that we exist, so they had to get creative. So that's why we also promote the idea of in urban areas having poor, moderate, and market in the same general area. But the politics for that is really difficult because those of you who would drive down 23rd Avenue right now, 23rd and Jackson, Paul Allen, Vulcan Corporation is building 520 units of housing, but they just wouldn't go for making 10% of those houses affordable, where people, traditional residents, can live there in their same neighborhood and be able to afford these brand new units of housing that are going to be built. So all the problems that people have just laid out over the last 15 to 20 minutes are going to be real for King County. And our hope is that by having a focused, innovative committee like the one that we have, that we're going to be able to come up with ideas that'll move us down the line farther than we ordinarily would get if we didn't have a specialized group working on how we make housing affordable. But as everyone has said, it's going to be extremely difficult. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Tosta?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to offer a strong second for what Dr. Chen pointed out, because I do think, having lived in different parts of this country, including on the East Coast, where townhouses are very common without formal living rooms and dining rooms, and it's just not so familiar to many people who live here. And the idea that we need to do some social marketing, if you will, to help people understand that there are alternative high-quality ways to have a home and live, and we don't do much of that. And I'm wondering if the needs assessment that we're going to do on housing can offer those kinds of alternatives and that kind of thinking when you look at what people would be willing to consider as an appropriate home, given the models that we've seen in other countries. And we do need more tools in the toolbox. You may all have seen in the news this past week the fact that Burien has had an apartment bought and all of the residents evicted with very short termination notice. And for us, we know it is just the tip of the iceberg. We have hundreds of older apartments in our community that we are going to see converted and upgraded, and those residents being potentially becoming homeless and not on the street, out on the streets. And I don't know what the tools are. I mean, we as a council are trying to figure out what our options are to try to address this situation rather than seeing our homeless population increase dramatically. But are there ways that we could incentivize that when a developer does this, buys out a property, incentivize some alternative development that they may be able to do that would accommodate these residents in a way that we haven't thought about before. So I just think, and these aren't needs, I mean, unfortunately, 2050 is a long way away. And, you know, the things that we have in our pocket now are just incredibly limited for helping that part of our population. And I think it was mentioned earlier by the Transportation Choices speaker that the 2/3 of the people who live here, I mean, how do we accommodate their needs and recognize that they want to continue to live here? I know some of the residents in the apartments we see in Burien are now looking, you know, let's move to Sumner. There's affordable housing there. Well, that's not going to help our transportation infrastructure. So, you know, this is just such a complex mix of things that the tools and pushing, even aggressively pushing some of our state laws that may impede our ability to think about condo or townhouse development. How do we sort of proactively work on these things sooner rather than later?
Vice Chair Margison.
Thank you. So I agree with a lot of all the comments that have been shared around the table. In fact, a lot of what we're sharing around the table is in Vision 2040. A lot of it is already in place, but we have to remember that Vision 2040 was adopted within the last 3 years. We've all adopted our comp plans, so we haven't had a whole lot of time to implement, if you will, or put on the ground floor much effort to get toward Vision 2040. However, having said that, some of the things that are in Vision 2040, we might want to, give a more robust effort to, and that's what I hear staff agreeing to, and I think what we're all saying. I especially like the concept of perhaps working with builders and saying, hey, is there a way for us to better coordinate diverse construction processes and techniques that better suit the needs of a evolving community, or evolving, a diverse community, if you will, that is growing in our general jurisdictions. Versus just saying different housing types, that sort of thing. Because I think we need to work together and not necessarily one group say this is how it's going to be without actually talking to another group, because we have to work together to make this happen. So I think there's some opportunity there moving forward, but I definitely think we're moving in the right direction. And again, we've been moving in the right direction. It's just slow going, unfortunately. And in terms of inclusionary housing, I'm sorry to hear about what's happening in your neighborhood. Councilmember Gossett and the City of Redmond has had an inclusionary housing ordinance for many years now, and it works. We get and keep affordable houses, affordable apartments, affordable condos at the 10% of all greater than 10 units are at or below 80% of the AMI, and now we've actually added some other incentives as well. So it works in our community and has worked for a number of years. So I would encourage everybody to try that.
Thank you. Councilmember Schwedde?
Okay, I agree with what everyone's saying, I guess, and when you talk about the toolbox and coming up with incentives to do some of these things, I guess my bottom line is, what can we do about accountability and how, if we just make suggestions, is there anything we can do so that they're more than suggestions, so that we know that there's follow through on that? I've got a whole list of things that Snohomish County have come up with that are actually, a lot of them are really good ideas on incentives for the income restricted housing and how we go about getting more and all of that. Some of them are things, funding that would require voters, which is fine when you're asking additional tax and stuff, but what can we do at this board that would make it not just suggestions, that somehow or another in the process, whether it's not just accountability, but if they're applying for transportation monies, do they get extra points if they've gone through and done some of those things? I guess that's where I would like to see happen.
Sounds like we're going to have a great future conversation on accountability. So we have about 5 minutes. Does it work with the chair and the board if we try and hustle through the rest of it? Thank you. So moving on to promoting affordable housing in all development, and many of the comments we just heard touch on this as well. So things that we heard, providing affordable housing is a shared effort, really, that we all have a responsibility to provide affordable housing. It may look a little different in different jurisdictions. To leverage growth to provide a more affordable housing, that with the historic growth we've seen and new development all around the region, these are really ideal opportunities to either promote or require long-term subsidized units in these new developments. And also that effective housing regulations can be tricky, how to effectively write them, to implement them, and to monitor them over time to make sure that they're getting the desired outcomes. So based on that, staff recommend including some introductory language about regional need by income level. So really just setting that foundation for the policies. And then secondly, a new policy to support and promote affordable housing near high capacity transit. So this is really focusing on long-term affordable housing in TOD areas. Also looking at strengthening an existing MPP H8, which talks about using techniques to promote housing of different affordability levels and types. We'd kind of like to just reframe that a bit to talk more about tools, incentives, regulations, use terms that are more in line with other plans and policies that are out there, and that focuses more on affordability and diversity of housing type, try and capture some of that missing middle and some of the other conversations we've heard. And then finally, to revise the second action about the regional housing program. And again, similar to what we suggested with the last action, looking at it, making sure that we have the resources, the capacity, the buy-in, both internally and externally to implement. So again, asking, are these updates headed in the right direction?
So why don't we go to, you have one more part, right?
We have a couple more,
Okay.
which we probably aren't going to get to.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the last comments talked about a lot of affordability. So we have affordability here, and then we'll talk a bit about maintaining neighborhoods and displacement, and we'll talk about
state level coordination.
Right, state level coordination. So things that have all been mentioned. So I think maybe it's best if Laura goes through those, and then we'll get some wrap-up comments. Generally, what I'm hearing is, as a theme, these are headed in the right direction. You as a board want to explore, how do we do this? What type of tools or ability do we have to make this stuff happen, whether it's by having directive policy or having points on grants or other types of incentives at the regional level? How do we provide assistance for the actions that are occurring at the local levels to make sure those things happen? So I think we're hearing the message loud and clear with the comments so far of that these are the things that we need to explore and bring back to you with the specific policy language of how can that language provide that type of direction and support, recognizing that there are limitations at the regional level and that we want to maintain a lot of flexibility at the local level so that different types of tools apply in different places, that we're not overly prescriptive. So if it's okay, I'd suggest let's have Laura do the next couple of sections.
Can you get through the next couple of sections, Laura?
And then we'll come back.
Great. So for invest in communities to maintain affordability, kind of the third category, we heard that we need more data to better identify places where communities are changing, displacement is currently happening, and also places where there's risk of this happening. We don't have a proposal just quite yet. Staff are working on a displacement risk analysis, and we'll be coming to you with that data soon. And then based on that data analysis and future board conversations, additional potential changes could come as part of that. Also, as Paul mentioned, this has already come up a little bit. We heard that there's some aspects of housing that need to be addressed by the state, either through legislative changes, support for planning grants, and things of that nature. So staff are recommending exploring a new housing action to engage and coordinate with the state on future efforts. And then finally, with accountability, as we've heard around the table, that there's a lot of strong housing policies out there, including Envision 2040, but it's hard to move that needle. It's hard to really get to that action stage. So we suggest having a future conversation where we can talk about a range of accountability options, kind of what's available now and how we could move forward. So based on all that, and we can follow up afterwards too if folks have questions, because I want to make sure we have time for the regional growth strategy discussion. If there are any other potential changes the board wants to explore, if there's anything you feel that we've missed based on feedback we presented today or that you've heard. And then in terms of next steps, we'll continue working with regional staff committee, external stakeholders coming back to you. And then as we discussed, we'll have future conversations on the displacement risk analysis and accountability.
Thank you, Laura. As you can see from the engagement, this is very, very important to all of us. Christopher, let's start with you.
Thank you. I'm going to triple down on Dr. Chen's comments about social marketing. I think there's been a lot of discussion about strategy, techniques, tools, the MPPH8 policy that recommends encouraging innovative techniques is kind of another one of those, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about innovative techniques? I think it would be great if the staff could come back with a couple of potential examples of what an innovative technique looks like. I think social marketing is a really kind of potentially an interesting way to explore what an innovative technique looks like. Otherwise, I'm not sure what the point of the policy is. It seems like it could get kind of lost in the shuffle between the other strategies and tools we're talking about. So if this seems like a good group to be able to discuss what innovative really means to all of us if we're going to take a risk on something. So let's have a discussion about what some of those options might be.
To clarify, we're proposing scrapping the term innovative techniques because we also weren't quite sure what it meant, and being more specific and directive about the types of tools, incentives, regulations that can be used at different levels of government.
I think all the tools that we talk about now regularly were considered innovative 10 years ago.
Deputy Mayor Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On one of your slides further back, Laura, you mentioned some specific requirements around affordable housing in transit centers. I co-chair the Regional TOD Advisory Committee, and at the back of your packet is a letter that we had commenting on the growth strategy, but specifically on this particular language, which I support, and the committee's comments was very supportive. They also had language that said that they want to make sure that we're supporting housing affordable to a range of incomes in proximity to transit. So would like to make sure that gets captured as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Steinbrook.
Just a quick comment on the Invest in Communities category. And it's kind of a question that I have as to how closely aligned are PSRC's funding, grant-making criteria with that goal of affordability and supply. So it seems that's one direct tool, and there should be alignment since affordability kind of rises to the top of our priorities in our long-term growth strategy. Of course, there are other drivers, I know, for transportation that are very important as well, such as freight mobility and congestion relief.
Thank you, Dr. Chen.
I just want to briefly comment about the regional health the regional housing assessment you'll be doing. I think we just need to make sure we, at some point as a body, we look at what they're measuring, because as Councilmember Gossett reminds us, that if you, for example, draw your lines really big around central area, you're going to get to pick up, and you average the incomes, you're going to totally miss the issue that there's certain groups and neighborhoods where their income and other needs are very different, and also as we look at what the bigger housing issue, I think you need to look at some of the upstream things around employment, other where people are in their lives and so on and so forth. So I just want to kind of make sure at some point we check in with staff about what they're looking at and make sure we have opportunity to expand that.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson.
Thanks. I want to echo what Deputy Mayor Arnold said about kind of income qualifications around transit-oriented development, but then also just generally say thanks to staff for continuing to keep an emphasis in here about diversity of housing types, particularly around transit stations. That long conversation we had at our last meeting around missing middle housing, I think is an important thread for us to continue to pull on. And, to the question that many folks have asked, there are a lot of different ways for us to think about operationalizing some of the objectives here. It could be as simple as asking individual jurisdictions to adopt targets. It could be more complicated, like if you don't meet your income restricted unit production target, there are consequences for transportation funding, for example, Commissioner Steinbrook. So, as we walk down the accountability threshold, there's a lot of different ways that we could try to achieve that objective, and there are pros and cons to each of those approaches. So as we think about how do we come up with a regional strategy that has a set of targets that are specific for us, but also has flexibility for individual jurisdictions to meet those targets, it's going to be a complicated web that we will weave. The last thing that I just want to say is, just a small refutation to a point that you made, Dr. Chen. I think that we need a diversity of housing types for all incomes on both the renting side and the home ownership side. And the reason why I say that is, I get concerned, as you, I think, articulated so well, about the conversion of existing housing into condos. But I don't want us to lose the opportunity that that remains, that for many low-income families, purchasing a property is the best way to generate intergenerational wealth opportunities. And so condos offer a lower price point than a lot of single-family homes do. And it continues that desire, I think, for us to see a lot more diversity of housing types and missing middle housing options, because without those lower price points, we continue that cycle of poverty that a lot of families can get out of when they are able to make that first investment in home ownership and property, and that creates an intergenerational wealth that I think Councilmember Gossett pointed out so well. We are really lacking in a lot of communities throughout the city and the county. So looking forward to further conversations and keep going. It's hard work.
Thank you for that. Councilmember Peltier, and then we're going to move on to regional growth strategy.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep this short. I'm hearing various members talk about accountability, and I've heard this before, and I think underlying this is this kind of desire to coerce certain jurisdictions to do what, to follow certain policies and do what some of us want them to do. The only stick you really have is to withdraw or to withhold transportation funding. And I think we need to take a little different approach than thinking we're going to coerce jurisdictions into accepting a certain amount of growth or creating a new density to accomplish goals. So I just wanted to push back a little bit on that. I think we need to inspire each other to some of these common goals. I know in my community on Bainbridge Island, we care about sustainability, we care about affordable housing. But again, we have limited tools, and the one tool we have is more density, and that's something we really don't want in general. So I just want to put that out there, that these calls for accountability, you're not going to force our community, for example, to take on density we don't want because you withdraw transportation funding. We gave back $2 million recently for a bridge that we didn't want. So we've got to find some other ways to get people to work together than to threaten to withdraw funding.
Vice Chair Margison.
Thank you. I'll make this brief, but Laura, you heard some talk around, and this goes back to the investing communities to maintain affordability. You heard some talk at our caucus meeting. We talked about this as well, about this conversion challenge that we're facing and the displacement that it's causing. And you said, step one is to identify. The notes I took said identify, and it's more of a data-driven exercise in terms of identifying these situations. Step two is how do you deal with it? And we're facing that reality right now in all of our communities. Much like Councilmember Tosta has, we have an apartment complex in our community that is being remodeled, and so all of the residents have been told move out, and you may not be able to move back in. And so they've all been displaced. And so I would hope that there are some communities out there somewhere that have had to go through this process that we could perhaps tap into and say, how did you deal with this? Is there something we could learn from what you've gone through, and perhaps not make the same mistakes over and over again, and learn from those and help those folks that are finding themselves in this situation, and then perhaps create model, sort of this is a way a jurisdiction can deal with it if they so desire.
Laura, it's clear that you and the staff team have listened really carefully to our previous conversations, so thank you for that, and you've continued to demonstrate that. I know you and Paul have been taking a lot of notes, including other staff in the room, so thank you for the follow-up you're going to do. In particular, in general, we heard that we want to be more aggressive. We clearly need more specific tools, specificity around the actions. We're interested in displacement, and we want to have much more conversation about the range of accountability options we can deploy, and just a lot of clarity about what's going to be different after this plan is adopted. So a lot of us said a lot of really good feedback, and I think this board really wants to stay in tight alignment as these policies and actions continue to mature over the next several months. So thank you. Let's move on to the regional growth strategy. Paul, do you want to tee this next one up?
I'll just fill time a little bit while Liz comes up to the table. We've had some great discussions about the regional growth strategy. I think you're familiar with a lot of the analysis here, again, talking about distribution patterns, so how we put all these different dots on the map and how do they get sorted across the region, while maintaining the urban growth boundary and maintaining many of our general objectives about growth within cities and in our centers, but recognizing there's still a lot of variability within that and different patterns that we can seek for the regional growth strategy. You've seen some of that initial work. We've been continuing to have a lot of discussions with our technical committees with staff, with different staff from around the region, and internally our modeling staff have done tremendous work, including some of them working parts of Labor Day weekend. So there's been a lot of development here. We have a few key questions. We think we're still on the right track. We want to confirm that with you, but we have a few key questions as we refine these. As Liz, I think, will reiterate here, we want to come back to you November 1st with these scenarios pretty well set, and if we have to make any adjustments, make them, but we want some good direction today so that we can come back November 1st with what you're expecting. That will then launch our environmental analysis. We'll go through and then we'll spend several months both doing that analysis and then working with you on developing a draft alternative over that time period. So right now, trying to work towards how can we support that environmental analysis piece. Okay, Liz.
Great, thank you. Yes, so we are going to talk through the growth scenarios again, talk through some of the proposed changes that we've heard about from staff committee, some of the feedback we've gotten, and then revisit our conversation about the jobs population share and our TOD goal. So we were last here at your September 6th meeting. We spent a good 3 hours talking through objectives, geographies, scenarios, all the details, the growth strategy. After that, as Paul sort of indicated, we've talked to the Land Use Technical Advisory Committee, the Regional Staff Committee, the co-chairs, as well as the TOD Advisory Committee about aspects of the growth strategy, and got some really good, useful feedback from them, which we'll kind of talk about in a minute here. Here we are today, and we will again sort of do a committee cycle this month and come back at your November 1st meeting, hoping to confirm some of the alternatives for environmental review, which would then be released ultimately later on in 2019. We've talked about the forecasts before, and there are 1.8 million people and 1.2 million jobs by the year 2050, and that, sort of a bit more color on that, as we've understood from trends and what we expect in the future, likely an older population, likely a more diverse population, and a smaller household size. So. Just some sort of color behind, the big number of 1.8 and 1.2 million people. We talked through the goals at several of the past meetings. I won't go into this in detail, but we have goals and objectives that we want to achieve with the growth strategy to sort of maximize a lot of benefits for our region in terms of the environment, in terms of our economy, in terms of transportation benefits overall. So going into detail on the growth scenarios, as you'll recall, the regional geographies has been a feature of our conversation the last, there we go. The last few months, these are sort of the basis of how we actually distribute growth within each of the scenarios. So I'll just kind of remind you that we have metropolitan core cities, as we do right now. Those are cities that have regional growth centers. High capacity transit communities is this kind of newer category that includes both cities and unincorporated areas that are planned for annexation that have or will have high capacity transit. If anyone comes up with a different name for this category, we'll happily take it. We've heard complaints with the name a lot. So. But we're still working on that. Cities and towns are remaining cities and towns in the region. Some of them have local transit service, and some of them may not have any access to fixed route transit at this time. Unincorporated urban areas are those places that are not necessarily planned for annexation or incorporation, or may not have access to high capacity transit. We also have rural areas, resource lands, and although not noted here, our major military installations that will be included as a regional geography. We had 4 growth scenarios that we talked about at the last meeting. One, extending Vision 2040 out to the year 2050. One, resetting the plan basically to the year 2017 and planning sort of set for those growth shares envisioned out to the year 2050. One that disperses growth more broadly across the region, and one that focuses on growth, especially near our high capacity transit areas. We talked through kind of the numbers a little bit at the last meeting, but this is just kind of a reminder that that sort of the dispersed urban growth scenario, which we've heard a lot of comment about, is the one that sort of shifts the growth most dramatically compared to the other scenarios, compared to the existing plan we have, and compared to the transit-focused growth scenario. This is a similar story on employment as on population. With it, we sort of initially developed dispersed urban growth was really designed to sort of distribute growth across all of our 5 major urban geographies. As a kind of getting back to the concept of screening factors, which we heard a couple comments about earlier today, there were a couple screening factors that we did not have at the last meeting, so I just wanted to sort of follow up and present them to make sure we get that information to you. We will be presenting the full list of screening factors at your November meeting, but this is just to highlight the growth in your transit and greenhouse gas emission screening factors are available for the previous scenarios. As these are probably very consistent with what we talked about at your last meeting with kind of the direction these scenarios were going, but very kind of minimal change with both forward from 2017 compared to the baseline, and certainly more growth in your transit in the transit-focused growth scenario, less in dispersed urban growth, and probably what you might expect in terms of the directionality on greenhouse gas emissions. So this is based on the scenarios we looked at last month. This is just to kind of revisit that. We have heard feedback about dispersed urban growth at the staff level committees, as we indicated earlier. Definitely a lot of comments and conversation about how the scenario is sort of fitting with the overall objectives for the growth strategy and kind of the role of that scenario kind of within the spectrum of options. And definitely some concerns that the allocations particularly to urban unincorporated and to cities and towns significantly kind of outpace the actual capacity that is in those places. So if we actually went through and assigned that much growth to those places, that they would then need to go up zone, plan for a lot more growth, that may not be consistent with kind of the overall objectives of the growth strategy. So one of the changes that we'll be making for this second round of modeling is using buildable lands capacity to help inform the allocation for those 2 geographies. So what that basically means, this turquoise box is highlighting dispersed urban growth. So the first scenario on the left had a significant amount of growth to cities and towns and to urban unincorporated. And you can see on the right that when we actually use buildable lands capacity, those growth expectations would be significantly scaled back, particularly for cities and towns, but almost kind of cut in half in terms of urban unincorporated as well. And so what we've done is then set the amount of growth allocated to those at the capacity plus a little bit extra, just to acknowledge that there may be some different growth patterns out to the year 2050, and then spread the rest of the growth amongst metro, core, and high-capacity transit. So we are starting to work on modeling for this type of scenario, but so we can come back with information about what this would look like. But I just sort of wanted to flag that these are some of the changes that we're incorporating based on comments that we've heard from staff committee. This is just population, but it's a very similar story on employment as well, which didn't want to overcomplicate things here today. On the transit-focused growth scenario, we also heard comments from the staff level groups about the amount of growth allocated to those high-capacity transit communities, that perhaps wasn't enough. So through this round of second round of modeling, we're adjusting the amount of growth basically that's going to those high-capacity transit communities. So you'll see here that the amount of growth in the first version of transit-focused growth was actually quite a little bit lower than in Stay the Course. So we wanted to make an adjustment to address that. And so we've increased the amount of growth from 17 to 23% for that geography, and have sort of scaled down both metro and core. It's still higher than Stay the Course, but not quite as much as higher as the previous iteration. So we'll continue to talk to staff about kind of some of the details of this. I know charts can be a little overwhelming, but we just kind of wanted to give a sense of kind of what some of the conversation has been and what some of the kind of updates that we're making for October to help inform kind of more robust scenarios the next time around. So just to recap, so we still have these 4 scenarios. And so it would be helpful today if you kind of have questions about the scenarios, but also if you have comments about whether there are things we should be changing, things we should be considering, so we make sure that the board is in a good place for your November meeting to help kind of make a decision. Ideally, we'll select 2 scenarios from the 3 that we have, the sort of action scenarios. And so it'd be great to sort of get a little bit of discussion feedback about kind of what you're thinking and what information or guidance you may have for us over the month of October to bring you what you want for November.
Good briefing, Liz. Thank you. Commissioner Steinbrück.
Thanks. I'm kind of curious where the dispersed growth model originated, or how that came to be as one of the 4. And secondarily, do each of the 4 represent similar high overall goals, or do they represent different objectives and goals? So if all 4 of them are responsive to our high-level goals, but with different implications in terms of impacts, costs, et cetera, that would be important to understanding for me, or if they're intended to be bookends. So I'm just not clear about that, what each of these scenarios represents in that regard.
Right. So stay the course is basically in the SEPA world our no action alternative. This is the plan that we have in place and the sort of point of contrast for study. So we have been looking for bookend alternatives to help the board kind of make a decision and develop a preferred alternative later on. So that was sort of the kind of origin story for why some of these scenarios were developed, that we wanted an option that sort of gave a more clear contrast to stay the course and the transit-focused growth. So that's sort of part of why we started developing dispersed urban growth. We've also just heard comments from folks along the way throughout the years that we were sort of perhaps expecting a little too much of a metro and core, that we should be encouraging growth or understanding that growth is going to happen elsewhere in the region. So it was sort of a kind of point of contrast. But obviously, we've been hearing a lot of comments that it is too contrasty, but people don't quite want that much contrast. I mean, I think that depending on sort of how any of these scenarios play out, there is, we've tried to address the objectives of the overall growth strategy, but certainly some of these are much more concentrated, much more sort of maybe actively address the kind of objectives overall that we've been looking for.
Zakiyama.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering on the dispersed urban growth option, I mean, I guess you could make an argument that you would want the bookends to be as broad as possible, and if you're going to actually study that, then it would show you in a really stark way what that would look like if you could do it. So I don't feel like that's a bad thing to consider doing it, because it would just give you some really interesting information. And we're looking region-wide, not just one county, but 4 counties. It might be really helpful to see that and get more of a real sense of what's going on and where we want to go, and the contrast might be helpful.
Deputy Mayor Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the direction that we're going, and as you're iterating on these scenarios, I think we're making progress on looking at the different scenarios, but also reflecting on reality. The thing that I don't see is how we make gains on the access to opportunity measures and the screening criteria. Looking at these different scenarios, they don't move at all, especially among low and very low income groups. And as suggested in the joint letter and from the public comment we've heard, are there growth strategies or tweaks to what we have here that actually do move those numbers? And I'm interested in that. But it occurs to me that perhaps the growth strategy alone is not the right tool or lever to move to directly impact equity. And if the growth strategy isn't, what are the policies within that strategy that do? And maybe we can look at the next level of that if the growth strategy itself isn't going to help access to opportunity, because that's something that I want to make sure that we're making progress in all the different screening criteria, and that one didn't move on any of them. Thank you.
I guess I just want to respond. It's kind of a yes and a yes. In the screening criteria that we were showing earlier, we do see changes as far as access to transit between the different patterns. So there is some of that, but I think you're headed down the right path of there are a lot of aspects that aren't just about the strategy. They're about how do we do it. Do we provide affordable housing or do we not around our transit stations? Well, if we do, then that increases access. If we don't, then we don't. So it's kind of a yes and yes of like, yes, there are elements and that we can measure that, but there are also a bunch of other aspects that are perhaps policy issues that we have to get into that will be separate from the pattern issue.
You know, it'd be great information to know if it's a yes and yes, it's a yes if you also do this.
Great point. Councilmember Johnson.
Thanks. Liz, can you tell me the difference between a forward from 2017 growth scenario and a dispersed urban growth scenario? Because I'm struggling with that. My assumption here is that most of our local plans that have been adopted assume some dispersed growth, and I just am not seeing a really large differentiation. But talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's true that in terms of the cities and towns, urban, unincorporated, and rural, especially the changes that we've proposing this for the second round of modeling, it's more in line with forward from 2017. It's not quite the same. There's dispersed urban growth right now has a sort of more equal distribution across metro core and high capacity transit, versus right now in forward from 2017, significantly more growth in metro and core near regional growth centers. So there are some differences. I think there could be an opportunity to try to kind of converge these potentially into something sort of more in the middle, if that's of interest. But I would say there are certainly forward from 2017, because it's resetting to right now, is more dispersed than vision and more dispersed than stay the course, but not as dramatically dispersed as you would see in this other scenario.
I think that that's important for us, and I would support the idea of kind of a merging of those two, because for me, the current sort of dispersed growth pattern, I see it as a tool to have communities who want to see more growth get less targets than they want, and communities who may not want to grow as quickly get higher targets than they want, based on the definition of forward from 2017. Maybe I'm reading that wrong, and I know, Mr. Chair, I'm going way down to the weeds here, but that's what you expect from me on this board. And so I would love to see us meld those two a little bit, because it seems like forward from 2017 are locally adopted plans that a bunch of elected officials have bought into as their growth strategies, and dispersed urban growth kind of upends that in some ways and says, no, we know you wanted to take more growth, but we want you to take less, and we know you wanted to take less growth, and we want you to take more. And so that seems like, considering what we just went through over the last couple of years to get everybody to say yes and certify all those comprehensive plans, to come back around a year later and say, you know what, we're going to study something that's totally different from the thing that you just adopted, seems a little inconsistent for me in terms of bookends. I appreciate your point, Patricia, that, you know, it would be a really good intellectual exercise for us to study what the impacts are of a totally dispersed urban growth, but putting the political screen in there, that seems a little bit of a disconnect to me.
Can you respond to the downsides of what Councilmember Johnson just was articulating? If we chose the forward from 17 and transit-focused growth along with stay the course, what's the trade-off there?
I think there's definitely something to it. What we're talking about with this plan is a longer time period and more growth, and so there's a little bit of more kind of wiggle room in that in terms of kind of what people are actually planning for. We've got plans out to 2035, not out to 2050, but certainly we've got communities that have accepted more growth from, especially with metro and core cities, that have kind of inconsistent with the plan that we've adopted. So I think that's a good sort of policy question for the board to consider. There are, I think, other things to think about. In dispersed urban growth right now, we actually have more growth to high-capacity transit communities than we do in Forward from 2017. So it actually has a higher expectation for some of those communities that will be getting investments into the future. So that does sort of set a sort of a different policy bar for those particular jurisdictions. But I think it's a good, interesting policy discussion.
Thank you. Councilmember Ryan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Liz, just a couple of questions here. So the stay the course / no action, if a city didn't meet its targets, it carries that deficit forward, doesn't it?
Okay, yeah. So
well,
if,
let me rephrase it.
Okay.
Differentiate between stay the course and forward from 17, because forward from 17, doesn't that reflect the current reality?
Sort of. So, so stay the course assumes the amount of growth between 2017 and 2050. And so if a jurisdiction, say like I think we can use Everett or Tacoma as an example, hasn't grown quite as much as they were expected to, it still makes up the difference in this scenario that you actually have a sort of slightly more growth through the year 2050. Forward from 2017 uses the vision numbers as they stand and starts over right now. So there would be slightly less growth allocated to some of those metro cities that haven't grown as much. There's actually more growth allocated to the city of Seattle because it has grown quite a bit. So there's a little bit of a kind of nuance kind of under the hood that's a little confusing to explain in a meeting.
Well, I think you actually did a really good job of that. So Snohomish County, I think we would, between the two, we'd prefer forward from 2017. My background is commercial real estate, and this reflects reality. So really what you're saying is, I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, what we're saying here is stay the course is, if you didn't hit your target and you have a deficit of, let's just throw a number out, 20,000 units, and you didn't hit it. So now we're going to set a new target for you of growth plus the 20,000 you didn't hit for. Well, if you didn't hit the 20,000 before, how can that be expected to make up that difference plus more growth? It's kind of, I'll give you an example. So up in Snohomish County, we have the fastest growing part of the county is my district because it's the south part of the county. And a lot of the builders, the two largest builders told me one of them said 70% of their buyers either work at Microsoft or Amazon. They're not working in Snohomish County. And the second largest builder, it's 50% of their buyers work at Microsoft and Amazon. So it's basically becoming a neighborhood of tech workers, which is fine. That's fine for it. But that's where the growth is. So for us to say, no, let's have that growth. I'll just give an example. All right. No, we want all that growth in Arlington. Well, is that reasonable if Arlington didn't hit their numbers before? And I'm not picking on you, Jan. I'm using that as an example. So I just don't think it's reasonable. I think we're fooling ourselves. And so I would just ask us to consider, shouldn't the numbers reflect the current reality and then allocate from there? And that, from what you're saying, would be forward from 2017?
Yeah, but just want to clarify. So for the purpose of the SEPA analysis, we're including a no action alternative, which is, in this case, stay the course. So I think based on what you're saying, it would mean either sort of selecting forward from 2017 as an alternative next month or incorporating aspects of that into something slightly different that the board does want to use.
Right. Well, I think in the end game, like a lot of things down here, we end up morphing somewhere in the middle, and it might be a combination of 2 or 3 of these, right? But I just wanted to point that out. What I'd like to do is have an end product that when we look 20 years back, while we're not sitting at these tables anymore, we look back and say we did it right. So let's have something that's achievable. That's all I'm trying to say. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, if I could, I'm glad that you're thinking ahead, Terry. This is going to make our work down the road easier. You're kind of thinking about the end game, about how do we bring these alternatives together. As Liz was saying, at this point, we're looking for something like that, the bookends on either side, so that supports a good SEPA analysis, one that's more aggressive for transit and one that looks at a counterpoint to it. So trying to craft those and refine those in a way that makes sense for people, that's not too weird or abstract, but fits. When we looked at the screening criteria last month with forward from 2017, and you can see here with the bar charts of those bar charts aren't very different from the stay the course. And when we look at the initial kind of read of the results, we don't see a lot of distinction at a broad regional level, recognizing that for an individual city, say like for Everett, there might be a lot of difference for that specific city. But looking at kind of the broad accumulation of regional data, they don't show a lot of distinction from a measure standpoint. So for a SEPA analysis, we're trying to point towards alternatives that will be more distinct, recognizing we may come back to that middle point as we pick a preferred alternative, or something that borrows from that.
Thank you. And I could have easily used Everett, but since Arlington was in the room, I thought I'd use that. But Everett is a great example. Thank you.
We're going to have a new rule in the committee. You can only pick on communities that are not represented in this room. Councilmember O'Brien.
I want to talk about North Bend. Councilmember Ryan, I appreciate your points, and I think the scenarios you laid out there are things that are going to be really important as we get towards the end of this process. But my understanding of where we are right now, and as we're trying to figure out what to study in the EIS, my goal is I really want to make sure we have a range of options that really help us when we get to that point to understand what are the different decision points that are going to kind of move needles on things we care about in one way or the other. And so, in light of that, one I got to say, as an academic exercise to just look at dispersed urban growth, it's kind of interesting, I guess, but it kind of fails on all the metrics in the early screening. And unless we're saying we want to take a big step back from Vision 2040, I'm not sure that it adds a ton of value. These EIS processes are expensive and detailed, and I would much rather dig into some distinctions that I think are going to be more interesting when we get to the point where we're looking about, what is growth in South Snohomish County look like, and if we want Everett to achieve greater growth in the next 10 or 20 years than they did 10 years ago, let's be realistic and what's that look like. And it's, maybe it's, well, we need high capacity transit there, which is on the way, and so let's figure that in, and maybe that changes it or not, or other factors. And so I don't see a big distinction between forward from 2017 and stay the course. I do think that I want to make sure that what we're studying allows us for some subtle distinctions when you make the difference. But when I look at transit growth and stay the course, that seems to cover a range that would include some version of forward from 27. And I think, again, Councilmember Ryan's idea of let's be realistic. We absolutely have to do that. And I want to make sure the ranges we're studying give us that option. Some of the things that I would love to see, the types of things that I think would be more interesting to incorporate for me is when we talk about TOD growth, is there a distinction between TOD around a rail investment or bus rapid transit? And I think we're lumping those into high capacity transit, but we also know that those investments in our community look different and develop differently. So maybe, instead of looking at a dispersed growth in the TOD, look at some different options about what that looks like. Maybe talk specifically about the distinction between the metropolitan centers in King County versus in Pierce and Snohomish County. As you said, Seattle has grown faster than its target, Everett slower in the last decade. Now that may all change as more rail options get delivered to those ends, but maybe studying some distinctions there about how we want to have some information. I want to include the ranges that I think realistically we're going to be encompassing, and I really don't anticipate us going back I hope we don't go back from Vision 2040. And as we make those distinctions, it'd be really great to have some good analysis that shows what those distinctions are going to mean and how they might play out.
Is that a good segue, Liz?
Sort of.
Okay. I was going to say, some of that stuff was queued up here in just a minute or two.
Yes. Oh, actually, we can switch order. Then it'd be a perfect segue. So yeah, we are going to shift gears and talk a little bit about. I don't know why this clicker isn't working very well.
This is Andy. I'm trying to jump in here. Maybe you're not hearing me.
I apologize, Commissioner Wolf. Go ahead.
Yeah, very, very briefly. It may be not surprising that Kitsap County would be stay the course. do want to thank the staff for the work developing these ideas to its members. I think the focus on high-capacity transit and designated regional geographics it's a sound framework for distributing future growth. But the lower classification of urban unincorporated areas is arbitrary, in our opinion, in absence of logic. Unincorporated urban areas with high-capacity transit, i.e. such as Kingston and Central Kitsap, are going to see the same growth pressures as its incorporated counterparts. And we would just say that under GMA, both incorporated and unincorporated areas must plan for similar urban growth with capital facilities to serve them. Lastly, I would just say we believe that these unincorporated urban areas with high-capacity transit should be considered a high-capacity transit community for the purpose of distributing growth throughout or through 2050. So I'll close that and just lobby for stay the course. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Vice Chair Margison, and then we're going to transition.
Well, I was going to suggest that, and I forgot my point. Well, too much talk. Anyways, and I don't want to cause us to go any further, but what I'm hearing and what I'm sensing around the table is the dispersed urban growth still hasn't quite hit the mark yet with this body. I mean, I agree with Patricia that we need something on the other side, if you will, because ultimately we're trying to do is say, what if, right? What if we go this direction? What are the impacts? And so let's give us a range of impacts. And then the other thing is, I just want to comment a little bit on what we heard earlier in the items from the audience around, we talked in the conversation around delay, and it was mentioned earlier about the difference between buses, bus rapid transit and rail transit, but also delay between sitting in a car versus sitting in a bus versus, other things. So perhaps we can sharpen our pencils a little bit and dig deeper into what is ultimately delay versus, delay in a bus, delay in a car, how long it takes you to ride a bike, walk, whatever the case may be. So those are the things I'd ask. And like I say, I don't think we've quite hit the mark yet on dispersed urban growth.
Councilmember Wren.
Keep it short, but I do think there may be some interesting things to look at dispersed urban growth, but I just would like to be much more targeted. Like an example that, I don't know how realistic it is, but maybe we think in our rural areas, instead of having a handful of large farms, we expect more and more young families to move out there and farm, but in smaller farms. And so that is kind of consistent with a vision I could see for the region, and that might mean a slightly different set of infrastructure. It's still rural and agricultural, but the population there might be slightly different. And it doesn't speak to me of like massive sprawl, it's just a different way to grow. But the models up there just feel like we're going to go way in the other direction, which is, and defeat all of our climate goals and other goals.
Councilmember Tosta, and then we're going to move on.
I just want to say, Liz, I know we're talking about housing, but it does seem that the sort of job discussion and the jobs close to housing, and even the example that Councilmember O'Brien just gave, more jobs in rural areas because they're smaller parcels of farms, changes, and yet people live there on those farms. The transportation impact is less than if, those jobs, you divided all those properties and those jobs were in the city and people had to drive in. So I know the jobs discussion perhaps comes later, but it just seems to me if we could talk about how do we have more jobs dispersed rather than having all the jobs in downtown Seattle, that just changes the model. So and we're not talking about those incentives or those activities necessarily. So
we've got slides for you.
Yeah, we do. We're going to do this perfect transition, and then we're going to get the other perfect transition about transit. So talking about jobs population shift between the counties. We talked about this last month. I just want to flag that one of the things that we heard a lot from the board was an interest in sort of looking at jobs housing balance a little bit differently. So we're trying to come up with other ways to measure and show this. This is still kind of, I think, a work in progress, but we tried to come up with a way to sort of, if you were to drop a person somewhere in the region and they look around, are they in a jobs-rich area, are they in a housing-rich area, or is it somewhere in the middle? And so based on the different scenarios, kind of the amount of growth that's happening in sort of more sort of balanced or near the average areas versus growth that's happening in jobs-rich or housing-rich places. So we're tending to see more transportation benefits from growth in that kind of purple zone of kind of more balanced, but I think we can come back and continue to talk about this some more. But trying to come up with some additional ways to sort of think about the question about jobs housing balance. But as Councilmember Tosta was just mentioning, there is still this question about sort of dispersal and the sort of dispersal of employment, particularly at the county level, which is kind of one of the most sort of fundamental places that we're sort of thinking about growth. It's just a reminder, when we developed Vision back in 2008, we shifted around some of the population and employment to try to achieve a sort of a different distribution by county, to try and encourage more employment growth in Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap, and more housing growth in King and Kitsap. So we talked about this last month. I think there were some folks that had strong feelings about it, but kind of wanted to come back and talk about this again. From the sort of staff level committees, one of the things that we've talked about is potentially just moving employment growth and doing maybe a 5% policy adjustment, as we did with Vision 2040 the first time, to move encourage additional employment growth in Kitsap, Pierce, and Snohomish. So if we did about 5%, it's around kind of 57 or 58,000 jobs from King County, and about adding another 23,000 jobs between Pierce and Snohomish, and about 12,000 jobs to Kitsap. So basically this would mean encouraging additional employment growth in those communities. So wanted to check in on this and whether the board wants us at this stage to move forward with this kind of policy-oriented adjustment, whether we want to do this. We could do this later as well as part of developing a preferred, but if there are any additional comments or feedback about shifting employment.
Maybe I should channel Councilmember Young, and I think he would argue for the balanced approach and the more dispersed job growth throughout the region.
Okay.
Any other feedback here?
If you have feedback later on, you can let me know.
Great. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think there's also interest, and I don't know if this impacts the overall strategy, is saying how do we encourage distribution of jobs housing balance amongst centers? And if you look at all the centers within each county, I think that was something we've had a fair amount of discussion about. I don't know if it directly impacts this topic.
Okay. We'll do some thinking about that. Okay, so we're going to shift and then talk about TOD here. So as part of the transit-focused growth scenario, basically we've developed kind of a sub-city, sub-jurisdictional geography to try to sort of focus more growth along our high-capacity transit lines. So this basically means our regional growth centers, a walkshed around light rail, commuter rail, and ferry, as well as bus rapid transit. This geography amounts to about 10% of the UGA, about 115 square miles. So I'll just kind of walk you through it here. So as you are all familiar, we've got 29 regional growth centers. We have 2 commuter rail lines and 14 stations, Sounder North, Sounder South. 9 ferry terminals that are included in this geography and 10 routes. 116 square miles of light rail, 80 plus stations, and then 42 routes of bus rapid transit, and it depends on kind of the numbers you're looking at, but approximately 800 or so stops along the way. So this is the geography that has really helped to inform the regional geographies that we've developed, and also our look more closely at what those station areas and how much growth that they may be able to accommodate. So this is about 42 of our cities and towns, includes 13 urban unincorporated communities, to sort of encourage additional growth around these high-capacity transit stations. We talked about this a little bit last month, but there's a question kind of in terms of how much growth we want to encourage near transit station areas, with what type of goal we want to set. And within our current plan, that sort of middle box, we're looking at about 44% of population and 60% of jobs. And we've done various sort of tests about kind of different levels of transit-focused growth, kind of in the sort of 70-ish range. We've also taken a look at some peer regions and what other regions are sort of have set as their kind of goals around growth near transit. These are communities which have different conditions, very different transit systems, age of transit systems, but it sort of helps to kind of understand, I think, what types of goals our communities are setting. Denver is a lot closer to our stay the course, or maybe a little bit less than some of these other communities like the Bay Area, which have a goal for a significant amount of their population and employment growth near transit station areas. So we also talked to the Regional TOD Advisory Committee about this, and maybe I'll just take a pause and see if Councilmember Arnold wants to talk a little bit about the feedback from that group.
The discussion on the group was really supportive of the transit-focused growth alternative, and talked that within our communities, we think this may be very different, but we're supportive of focusing growth among our transit stations. There was concern very much along much of the discussion today around displacement, around making sure that there were opportunities at all income levels at our transit stations, and I think we've covered that pretty thoroughly previously today.
Great. So the question for you is kind of about how we sort of set that ambitious goal, kind of keeping in mind the conversation we just had about a bookend and trying to sort of like find what the sort of maximum range is that you may want to set, and we could sort of, you know, potentially change it in the preferred alternative. But would 75% of population employment be an appropriate amount? Does the board want a little higher, a little bit lower? It would be really helpful to get some feedback about kind of what the goal might be, and if this if there'd be comfort around this type of level.
Commissioner Wolf, were you trying to chime in?
No, I've already chimed in. Thank you.
Okay, great. Councilmember Johnson.
Thanks. Liz, I think it's a good place to start. One of the things that I'll be looking for is to see what kind of impact that would have towards our adopted greenhouse gas emission goals and set by the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, and we may find that 75-75 gets us to our objectives around GHG reduction, and we may find that it doesn't. So I'd like for that to be included in the analysis that we do, and the flexibility to say, boy, maybe we need to go something higher if that kind of focus density around transit doesn't get us to the clean energy future we know we need.
Thank you. Mayor Patansu.
The population number I can get to, but my concern with the employment is we have an industrial park that isn't anywhere near a transit center, and that's where we'd like to see the job growth. And I'm not sure that our ports and other industrial areas have those facilities. So that would be my concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it depends on what manufacturing industrial center we're thinking about, but you can see here under the sort of left side the existing number. So the current share of regional employment, about 47% of our regional employment is in those corridors right now. So I guess the question is kind of about the goal of how much growth. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. Okay, so in the absence of other comments, I think we'll sort of proceed forward on the 75 number for now, and we can talk about this a little bit more at the November meeting. But that's really all the content I have. And so we are going to continue to talk with the boards and committees this month, see what else we can kind of come up with in terms of dispersed urban growth. Seems like there's a lot of interest in that. And we'll be coming back with a package for you at your November 1st meeting to try to reach a conclusion on selecting alternatives.
Thank you. Councilmember O'Brien.
A couple brief comments on kind of the more technical details on the screening criteria. Councilmember Murchison, I think, touched on this too. I think when we look at delay, it'd be great to look at the distinction between delay for people that are in single occupancy vehicles in the general purpose lanes versus, you know, transit and high capacity HOV lanes versus rail, and so those lumping those together, I think, could dilute what we're trying to understand. So breaking that out is important. And again, to the comment in the letter we got from advocates about social equity, I think it's really important that we're being really specific about what we're talking about. And so I'm thinking of low income and communities of color having access to opportunities. And so I think being explicit that that's what we're talking about and measuring so we can see what's moving the needle is going to be important to me.
And having an example measure that gets to that, a specific measure. Mayor Wheeler.
I should know how to do this by now. So when do you expect to get those packets out to us? You know, even though this is kind of light roundtable discussion, you know, and almost brainstorming, I see decisions now coming, and we're going to take these decisions very seriously. So we want to ensure we review the expectations.
Yeah, I mean, given the timing around the staff committee meeting, I think it would be a little bit hard for us to get the packet out more than a week ahead of time, although I think we could try to send some supplemental information to the board prior to that, if we have some things together, especially if we've made any changes around dispersed urban growth. But definitely a week ahead of time before the meeting.
Okay, thank you.
And I will reiterate what Liz was just mentioning, that we'll be talking with the regional staff committee. Many of your staff are part of that committee, so they'll be seeing some sort of interim product between now and the November meeting. And we'll encourage those staff to talk with you, keep you in the loop as to how things are evolving.
So to be clear, we're going to try to come to our next meeting prepared to make a decision about which two of the three to move forward. So yeah, let's do our homework and talk to who we need to talk to come prepared for that. Paul, I'll ask you in the interest of time, offline, to circle back with Commissioner Wolf about his inquiry about unincorporated areas, and I think there's a clarification there about transit communities in this context being those unincorporated areas, but if we could circle back with him on his inquiry, that'd be helpful. Seeing nothing else, the next meeting is an extended meeting to get at this decision about how we're moving forward with the growth strategy, environmental analysis, and then diving into economic portions of the plan and public services portion of the plan. So have a good fall, everybody. We'll see you next month. We stand adjourned.